Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the SHEF Fiscal Year 2014 webinar to go over the summary of our data and the findings from the report. My name is Andy Carlson, as I think most of you know, and John Armstrong will be joining us in a little bit to give us a tour of the supplemental data on the website. Before I dive into the content of today's webinar, I just want to share some basics for housekeeping. Due to the large response, you guys will be muted for this presentation. As far as Q&A that we'll do at the end of the presentation, we'll dedicate some time to that, and then you can ask questions in the webinar room by typing them into the Q&A box, and we'll take them as they come at that point. We may skip over one if I think more detail is required and respond via email, but we'll take all the questions that we get. You may also use the chat system in the webinar program, but we probably won't be monitoring that as closely. If you do have any difficulties during the webinar, you can email John Armstrong at jarmstrong@sheo.org. All right, so let's dive in. The agenda for today is to go over the SHEF project, and I do want to highlight the changes we made this year because they were kind of extensive, and we want to spend some time on the findings and kind of go over what the national and the state level data tell us about where things stand in fiscal year 2014 compared to prior years. And then John Armstrong, an information analyst here at SHEO, will do an interactive data demonstration. One of the big changes we made was incorporating some using Tableau software to make the state level data interactive. And then we'll have time for questions and answers. Okay, so I think as many of you probably know, but this was my fourth year where I compiled and wrote the SHEF report and managed this project. And last summer I started to really think about ways to make the report and also the supplemental materials we provide more useful. At least I hope I could come up with ways to make them more useful for data users and policy analysts and the data providers. So I had some ideas, but before I just wanted to dive in and make wholesale changes, I surveyed the SHEO agency financial officers, and I surveyed the data providers, and we sent a survey out to the broader policy community, to those analysts and people at think tanks that focus on higher ed that I knew relied on the SHEF report. And so the ideas that I had to make some changes were all supported by these surveys. And really, I think most responses kind of came back as, your changes are good ideas, just make sure you don't change the underlying data, because that really is the strength of the SHEF report and the SHEF project. And so don't worry, that certainly didn't happen. I do want to thank SHEO's president, George Herbsteiner, who fully supported moving forward with these changes, and we really appreciated that. So just real quickly, the first thing, maybe the most obvious change, is that we hired a graphic designer to refresh the look of the SHEF report. So that ubiquitous green cover is now gone. And you'll see, I understand, and I certainly agree that the tables and charts in the actual report are much easier to read. They're a little crisper and cleaner, and the whole report just has a refreshed look. But more substantively, this year's narrative includes 4 case studies, and my goal here was to pull out some important context of the report, context that would allow us to explain some data outliers or just provide some historic perspective on what the last couple of years' data were showing. So those 4 case studies in the report, the first one is entitled Impact of Base Year on Percent Changes. The goal here is to make clear that with the 2 years of per student funding increases, it's important to look at the longer trends and kind of consider where we are in relation to pre-recession levels and 25 years ago, not just look at, a couple years of increases and assume that is all you need to consider. The second one is a couple paragraph case study on revenue versus rate percent changes. The last couple of years, SHEO's the SHEF net tuition revenue data has, some people use that to, use it as like a proxy for tuition rate increases. And while a rate increase is certainly a big part of why net tuition revenue goes up. There's other factors as well, such as enrollment growth, and perhaps changes in the mix of where that tuition revenue is coming from. Perhaps more graduate students paying a higher tuition rate, or more out-of-state students. Like all those components drive changes in net tuition revenue. It's not just a rate increase. The third case study is dealing with a big outlier that we'll talk about a little bit later, and that is SHEF, the Illinois data. So Illinois shows the largest per-student funding increases, and we spend a lot of time, a full page in the report, talking about why that is. The new money is all going to backfill pension obligations, and they've also had significant enrollment declines, so we wanted to talk about that. And finally, the last case study in the report is about kind of looking ahead to what the impact of falling oil and gas prices might be on some of those states that have always been, kind of SHEF winners, like, Wyoming and Alaska and North Dakota, that have been on the, the side of like the largest percent increases or like the largest funding. And, those states are dependent on oil revenue. So what do these continue? They're dependent on severance taxes from oil revenue. So what does the continued low price of oil mean for them in the future? And the last, and I think most important change we made was we added interactive data capabilities on our website. And I'll let John talk about that a little bit later when he gives you a tour of those capabilities. But, just as one example, a lot of the policy analysts that utilize SHEF every year, one of the first things that many of them do is back out our HECA inflation adjustment and use CPI. So John will give us a tour a little bit later, but that is certainly one of the capabilities that we have. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of going over what we actually measure in the SHEF report, and talk about the adjustment factors, and then we'll dive into the data. So here are the SHEF metrics, and these are kind of what we're measuring. So first and foremost, we look at state and local support, and this is our starting point, and this is just the total funding provided by the states and local governments in both nominal and real inflation-adjusted terms. So that's kind of where we start in the report. The next three metrics that I'll talk about make up the wave chart, which is probably the first thing people look at if they're familiar with how SHEF is set up. So the first part of that is educational appropriations. This is that amount of state and local support that goes to the general educational delivery at public institutions, and it's shown as a per FTE figure. So we show it as on a per student basis and track that over time. The next part is net tuition revenue, also shown per FTE, and this is the gross tuition revenues from public institutions that the data providers provide us. We back out any institutional aid or state financial aid that goes to students at public institutions, and we also back out any tuition for medical school students. And then lastly, for the wave chart, we're tracking FTE enrollment. So we collect FTE at the state and national level, track that over time, and use those numbers to derive our per student funding levels. And then the final metric, total educational revenue, is simply the sum of those educational appropriations and the net tuition revenue. I'll talk briefly about the three adjustments that we make. The higher education cost adjustment, or HECA, is the inflationary adjustment that SHEO developed internally for the first SHEF report. And the intent here was to develop an alternative to the Consumer Price Index and also the Higher Education Price Index, or HEPI. So HEPI was kind of the existing higher ed specific, industry specific inflation factor that was used at the time, and there was a pretty serious critique of it that it was self-referential because it was driven by faculty salaries extensively, and so faculty salaries would go up, HEPI would go up, and then you could argue for more funding because to keep up with that larger inflation. So that was the critique of HEPI. So SHEO decided to employ this other measure, and we pulled it from two existing federal indices. So we didn't develop it. We came up with it, but we didn't kind of come up with the calculations. We used two existing indices, the Employee Cost Index and then the GDP, Gross Domestic Product Implicit Price Deflator. So we use those, we combine them, 75% and 25% respectively, to come up with HECA. And just as an example, in that green box, if the FY fiscal year 2013 appropriation was $1,000, you could divide it by HECA. $1,000 divided by that number takes the 2013 $1,000 up to 2014 at 1,018. I mentioned that the other higher ed industry, HEPI, has some criticisms. Well, HECA is not critique-free. The main criticism of HECA is that it historically has grown more quickly than CPI and therefore overstates the amount of support institutions need in order to keep up with inflation. And then another critique is that if you think about the tuition revenue numbers and tuition increases, HECA is really meaningless measure for families struggling to pay those costs, right? I mean, like, yeah, it might measure more appropriately the revenues needed at higher education, but as what families are struggling to pay tuition, like, CPI makes more sense. So I've heard those criticisms for the last couple of years. That our response would be that higher education's primary costs are driven by personnel expenditures, and that makes up the bulk of this higher education market basket of goods. And our intent with SHEF has originally and continues to primarily be measuring the revenues needed for higher education institutions to deliver general education services. So from that perspective, HECA is a very reasonable measure to do that, since it does rely on existing measures. And quite honestly, the last couple of years, since 2007, there's been very little difference between CPI and HECA. So HECA is actually not growing faster. In fact, CPI is growing faster due to flat salaries across the nation. But we certainly agree that CPI is a better measure for tuition rate increases. And so, as John will talk about later on, like, one of the reasons, we wanted to do some interactive abilities with our supplemental data was to allow people to kind of make their own choice. But all the data in the report is adjusted for HECA. Okay, and real quick, two more adjustments that we make to the state level data in the middle of the report. We make two additional adjustments for each state. And the purpose here, the intent here, is to make the state data more comparable, across the 50 states. So the first adjustment is the Enrollment Mix Index, and we do this to adjust for differences in the mix of enrollment and the costs across those institutions among the states. And we rely on IPEDS data for this. This adjustment factor is recalculated every 2 years. It just accounts for, like, maybe a state like California with a significant proportion of their students enrolling in community colleges. We want to account for that when we compare it to a state like Alaska that has a very small 2-year sector. The second adjustment we make to the state level data is a cost of living adjustment, or a COLA. And we do this to account for those cost of living differences. We want to make, an expensive state like Hawaii or Massachusetts or New York comparable to a state that's not so expensive, like an Arkansas, for example. So we do that in the report, and as an example, state X, if it had $1,000 educational appropriation, the adjustment is kind of made just like HECA. Your EMI is 0.95, so you divide by that, and that actually increases the overall appropriation. And then if COLA is 1.01, so in this hypothetical state is slightly more expensive than the U.S. average for cost of living, that would actually drive down the number a little bit. So we end up with a state with an actual appropriation of $1,000 being shown in the report at 1,043. Okay, so finally we are at the data, and so the next few slides are some of the key charts in the report, and I'll talk about each one briefly. First off, here's the national wave chart. This chart shows per student educational appropriations. Those are the light blue bars across the bottom of the page of the chart. It also shows per student net tuition revenue. Those are the green bars stacked at top. And it shows enrollment. That's FTE enrollment is the red trend line. Data is shown for the last 25 years, and all these dollars that you see are taken up to 2014 using our HECA cost adjustments. And, you know, right off the bat, we call this the wave chart, as you can probably figure out, because it kind of shows the ups and downs of the economy on per-student financing of higher education. The impacts of recession is very apparent, especially the recent Great Recession of the late 2000s. Because in each recession, we see a reduction in per-student support. That's the decreasing blue bars, and we see an increase in tuition, the green bars, and then we see typically during recessions, you see the red the red FTE line increase. Enrollment goes up, right, during economic downturns. And then when you have recovery, we see the blue bars go up, that's educational appropriation, and then the tuition growth slow down, and we see enrollment flatten out or decline. So you can really see the impact, tremendous impact of the Great Recession on the SHEF data. 2010, 2011, and 2012 were each of those reports, we said this was the worst year of the last 25 years. It was the lowest number, and it just kept going down. 2013, we saw a very slight uptick in funding. So the blue bar went up slightly from 6,122 in 2012 to 6,215 in 2013. The overall funding was actually flat during those 2 years, but the per-student increase was due to a slight decline in enrollment. In 2014, the per-student funding goes up 5.4% to 6,552. This increase was driven in part by an enrollment decline, but really primarily it's driven by funding increases. So 2014, we finally started to see actual increases in funding overall. And so that's the general view of the national data, but another way to look at it is to focus on the total educational revenue. So if you look at the total, the sum of the blue and the green bars stacked atop each other. And if you do that, you see that 2014 is actually one of the best years we've had in total revenue per student nationally. It's above $12,000 and close to the highs that you see in the late 1990s and in 2001. Of course, the share of that revenue from tuition is much greater, so I'm not saying that we're in, awesome times, but it is one way to look at it that, in total, our national numbers are approaching some of the higher levels that they've been at in the past. So building on that, this chart in the report, net tuition as a percent of public higher education, total ed revenue over the last 25 years. So this is tracking that share of our total revenues coming from tuition. And it's tracking it for the last 25 years. So in 1989, you see that the amount was 24.5%. So the green, basically if you went back to the wave chart, the little green bar was 25% of the total. And now in 2014, we're at 47.1%. So this chart, just like the wave chart that I just showed you, really shows the impact of recessions. Every time there's an economic downturn, the share from net tuition, increases rather significantly. We see that in the early 90s, we see that in the early 2000s, and then we see the steepest increase in our data during the Great Recession, 08 through 2010. So this trend peaked at 47.7% in 2013, and now it's declined slightly. So that's another indication that economic recovery is occurring. That's happened in prior recessions. But although it declined slightly, it never really returns to pre-recession levels, right? It kind of just stays at this new level. And the question I got asked from a couple of reporters this year when SHEF was released was, when are we going to hit that 50% mark? And it certainly looks like we were well on the way, but now we're seeing a slight decline. But, you know, if you think back to what this data show us and the impact of recessions on this measure, it seems pretty clear that we're going to kind of hover around this 47 and a half mark until the next economic downturn. And then if the past is any indication of the future, you would expect this number to go above that 50% mark during the next economic downturn. So this is a new chart that we added into the SHEF report this year. And it's the percent change in fiscal year 2014 educational appropriations per student since fiscal year 2008. So 2008 was the pre-recession high point. It was the highest level of state and local funding that we had before the Great Recession hit in 2009. And what this chart attempts to do is put the recent 2 years of increases in per student funding into a historical perspective and show the impact of the Great Recession on funding. So across the chart, the blue bar, each blue bar is simply the 2014 per student funding, right? And then the green bars are various base years. So if you start on the right, you see that 2014 is 5.4% above the 2013 appropriation per student. It's 7% above where we were in 2012, so that's at 2 years of increases. But then as you go across the other years, 2011, 2010, 2009, and 2008, you see that we're still below those funding levels. So on a per student basis, despite 2 years of increases, we remain 18.9%, so almost 19% below where we were in 2008, that pre-recession high point. One more national chart, and then I'll talk briefly about some of the state-level data that we have. This chart comes from the final section of the SHEF report, where we look at tax capacity and higher education support per capita, and also per $1,000 of personal income. I just wanted to highlight a couple points evident in this data. You know, we've been putting this in the back of the report every year, and this is the first time that I think anyone at SHEF has ever kind of put it into a webinar. But so despite a couple-year lag in this data, we see that 2012 total taxable resources per capita, the bottom left of that chart, at 58,163. That's higher than pre-recession levels, like pretty significantly higher, like 10% higher. So we're seeing in this measure indications of recovery. However, the state and local tax revenues per capita, so not the resources available for tax revenues, but the actual revenues themselves, aren't growing as quickly. They're not catching up. They're you know, just sort of where they were pre-recession. So it seems like there may be a structural issue here. Like, are the state and local tax policies regressive and not capturing the wealth that's coming from higher incomes? You know, in states that have sales taxes and drive a lot of their revenue from sales taxes, is the proliferation of online shopping and people spending their disposable income on services as opposed to goods that, you know, perhaps those services aren't taxed the way the goods are. You know, are these kind of structural issues stifling the recovery somewhat? And then finally, on the bottom right hand, you see state and local higher education support as a percentage of the tax revenues. And at 2012 at 5.8%, that's the lowest number we've seen since 1990, which is as far back as this component of SHEF, the data go. Okay, so the next four charts look at the states themselves. So the first one, this is full-time enrollment equivalent for each state, and we're looking at a 5-year percent change. So how are states growing or declining in FTE enrollment since 2009 to 2014? So nationally, we're up 3.9% over the last 5 years, and 43 states show enrollment growth. Some of the greatest enrollment growth is in the western states. Idaho has got the largest growth since 2009 at 25.7%, Oregon at 16.9%, and Utah at 11.2%. On the other end, I'll talk about two states real quick that show significant decline. Illinois shows a significant decline in enrollment, and that does help to explain their large increase in funding per student on the next slide. And then California also shows a large decline since 2009 of about 7%. And in California, recall that large cuts were made during the downturn, and they actually had, understand, froze enrollment at their community college sectors. So while the funding is recovering there, and enrollment has started to increase again, at least over the last year, they're still down from where they were in 2009. So the next chart is educational appropriations per FTE, and this is a percent change again between 2009 and 2014, so a 5-year look. And over the last 5 years, only 3 states show any increases in per student funding. And those are Illinois, North Dakota, and Alaska. So again, Illinois' per student funding driven in large part by the decline in enrollment, right? If enrollment goes down, flat funding will drive an increase in per student funding. But the real driver is the fact that they've been backfilling their pension program and obligations that they've developed over time that haven't been funded. As an example, some auxiliary or supplemental data that Illinois' Board of Higher Ed provided us, I think in 2007 they provided $67 million into their pension program for higher ed, and in 2014 they provided $1.5 billion, and then at the same time their kind of regular appropriations for their higher ed public institutions has been at about $2 billion in total. So that significant increase is entirely going to cover previously underfunded pension obligations. The second state with a large increase over the last 5 years is North Dakota. And North Dakota, as I understand it, has really seen an uptick in the revenues they're deriving from some of their oil, gas, and mineral extraction up there. And, you know, North Dakota is a state with a pretty small population, so they're putting a lot of new money into their higher education system. And then the third state that shows a slight increase over the last 5 years is Alaska, but I understand that they're starting to see real impacts from their oil and gas revenues, so this next year's data might look very different for that state. But again, most states, 47 states, are not where they were in 2009. Nationally, we're down 13.3%. And we have states that have made cuts in excess of 30%. You see Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Colorado, New Hampshire, and Idaho have all seen their per student appropriation funding decline by more than 30%. Okay, so this is each state's net tuition revenue as a percent of public higher education, total educational revenue. So this is kind of each state's where they're at and their student share, the share coming from that tuition revenue. You see right in the middle the U.S. average of 47.1, so that corresponds to the trend line data that I showed you earlier. And we see a very wide range across the states, from a low of 15.1% for Wyoming to 84.5% for Vermont. And so while this measure has grown nationally, if you think back to that tuition trend line that I showed you earlier, and in most states, the share coming from students and families has certainly gone up as well. You know, the states aren't really moving around like relative to one another. While everyone's kind of gone up, no states are really like swinging from like being a really low tuition state to a really high tuition state overnight, or vice versa. So finally, here's the 5-year change in total educational revenue. And recall that only 3 states showed an increase in educational appropriations per student over the 5-year period. But this chart shows the impact of those tuition increases and increased reliance on tuition revenue across the state. So when we look at the total revenue, that's sum from appropriations per student and net tuition revenue per student, we see how that increased reliance on tuition has offset the funding decreases in about half the states. About half the states show positive gains, in this measure in total educational revenue per student. And nationally, we're at 1.7%. Again, Illinois is an outlier. Okay, so one more quick slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to John Armstrong to walk you through some of our supplemental data that we have on our website. So the SHEF data nationally for the last 2 years point to economic recovery, right? The educational appropriations per FTE have increased each of the last 2 years. Last year, 2014, the share coming from net tuition revenue declined slightly, and both of those are definite indications of economic recovery having a positive impact on, higher education financing, without question. But, as we look into the data and we really start to drill down a little bit, this recovery definitely seems precarious. We're still below our pre-recession levels, despite 2 years of per-student funding increases. 13 states actually saw per-student decreases in funding in 2014. It's not that they necessarily made cuts, but the combination of funding levels and enrollment changes led to a funding decrease on a per-student basis. The grapevine data that we also collect for 2015 and just the total unadjusted appropriations, 10 states made cuts in 2015 appropriations. We have the situation in Illinois where their increases are going entirely to offset pension shortfalls, and other states have pension challenges. We know that those are probably coming. States depend on oil revenues. They're looking at kind of a precarious situation. And then we talked about structural issues. So, not to be Debbie Downer, but, this economic recovery definitely seems a little precarious, and it's going to be really interesting to monitor this data over the next couple of years. With that, I'd like to turn it over to John Armstrong to provide a demonstration of the supplemental data resources available on our website.
Thank you, Andy. And looking at the attendee list for this call, I see a lot of our SHEF data providers. So thank you for making sure that your data is in and consistent and good. Just a little bit about me, if you don't know me. I've been at SHEO for a year now as an information analyst. And prior to that, I was working at the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. And due to a retirement and a need for somebody to quick fill in, I was actually the SHEF data provider for the 2013 report. And I was kind of freaking out because I couldn't replicate the last year's numbers and I couldn't get the exact same figures. And I called Andy and he assured me that while consistency is important, what's better is to think about what the SHEF report is asking. And he explained that very well, and we got to a process where our data was consistent. And so it's kind of nice to view this from both sides. And when he brought me on board at SHEO last year, fresh off the heels of SHEF 2013, he had big ideas and big plans and wanted to make the data more presentable to users. And I've worked with him on that, and we've implemented our ideas together. And we hope that all of you are happy with the product as well. So if you go to our website, sheo.org, and you go to the SHEF page right here, this 4-panel chart will either take you to the report itself, where Andy sourced all of the charts from the webinar. So if you want to read the entire report, you can click that link. There's some overall history and background material on the SHEF project in this link, and then for data providers themselves, if you want to connect to the database system or make adjustments to your data, then you can click this link. But the actual charts are all here on this View the Data page. And when you click that, you can again link to the report, return to the SHEF main page. The Tableau data is accessed by clicking on this button right here. And then some of the previous times that you've accessed this page and looked at the data, if you want to get our unadjusted nominal data set, you can click here. All tables and charts from the report are available right here. And we have state-by-state charts. So if you want to view your individual state in an Excel format, that you can see that there. There's also additional data down here for all states and all nominal data. But for now, I'm going to click on the interactive SHEF data link. And when you get to that link, you'll first get to an About the Data tab. And this is, if you want to kind of see where the adjustments are and how we adjust for some charts and not others. For example, we have 3 maps that look at all the states across each other. And the purpose of those maps is to sort of see your state in comparison to other states that are around you in an easy manner. So for those metrics, we're adjusting by the enrollment mix index and COLA, as Andy explained earlier in the report. However, in some of the other tabs, like the state wave charts, we're viewing a state individually. So those sort of adjustments to compare between states aren't necessary at that point. So we get into the nitty-gritty of all that in this tab and explain some of the SHEF metrics, as Andy did earlier in today's webinar. We have an example of how higher education cost adjustment works and ask for citations. So that's the sort of the landing page. Once we get here, then the first three maps look at our key three SHEF metrics: educational appropriations by state, net tuition revenue by state, and total educational revenue by state. This one's the educational appropriation one. And when you first land here, you can mouse over one state and see both what the educational appropriation is and how that's changed over 1 and 5 years. And I'll start with Illinois just as an example of seeing how dramatic their increase has been from the 2013 report to the 2014 report. An increase of $2,600 per student is very significant. Because it's my hometown, I lived there for 28 years, I'm going to kind of stick to the Minnesota story. And when Andy and I were thinking about this map, whenever the SHEF report came out at the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, the first question was, A, how is Minnesota doing, and then B, how's Wisconsin doing? So a map like this, I think, allows us to kind of view those two right next to each other and see kind of where the trend is. Minnesota, for example, has an increase from the 2013 per student educational appropriation of $514, but much like the national average over the last 5 years, it's not returned to pre-recession levels. This chart also allows you to go back to prior years. So you can see the 2013 level, Minnesota was lower in per student educational appropriations and was kind of starting that downward trend. And in the pre-recession level in 2007, their educational appropriations per student were much higher. And the 1 year and 5 year change and the enrollment will automatically update as you change the years for all of these graphs. You can see the average for the United States at the bottom and also the United States trends as well. And data are adjusted by HECA-COLA and the EMI, as I mentioned earlier. We undertake a similar process for our other metrics. This is our net tuition revenue map. So the portion of educational revenues in the states that you could think of as being borne by students and their families. Oil-rich states such as Wyoming, that level is a little bit lower, whereas in New England states you can see it's much higher in this graph. And then sticking to the Minnesota story, over the past year, because of their funding increases, the 1 year change in net tuition revenue per FTE has actually gone down, but again hasn't returned to pre-recession levels, where the share was less borne on students than it was on educational appropriations. And like the other maps, you can go back in time as well and kind of see the effect of that over the rest of the time. The total educational revenue map is just looking at the sum of those two metrics. And again, you can see the 1 year and 5 year changes in the U.S. averages here at the bottom. I won't spend too much time here on that. Student share is our kind of shorthand way of talking about what percent of revenue in the state is borne by students and their families. So this is, again, net tuition as a percent of total education revenue. And this line looks probably familiar to the chart that Andy showed you earlier. You can kind of imagine where those recession boxes are. They're all in those big upticks. And the orange line that you see when you first land on this page shows you the United States average. And you can mouse over and see that. The scale on this graph will adjust as you start to interact with it. And we wanted to do that because we wanted to have the U.S. line show the impact of those recessions. But as we input both a regional aggregation and a state aggregation of the data, then the scale will change accordingly. So we do aggregate states, and we decided to do this by the compacts. So the Midwest Higher Education Compact, New England Board of Higher Education, Southern Regional Education Board, and Western United States Commission for Higher Education. Those states all have their data aggregated by region, and a suggestion when we debuted this data to a different audience, and we are exploring this. We want to kind of have users be able to define their own peer group. So we hope to kind of roll that out in the future. This will be an ongoing process. Sticking with the Minnesota example, I'm going to compare them to the Midwest Higher Education Compact. And MEC states in general trend above the national average, as you can see. If we went to other regional compacts, NEVI is even higher. The Southern Regional Educational Board kind of trends with the national average, and then WICHE states are largely below the national average. You can then input your individual state and see what the story is there as well. So Minnesota, for a long time, tracked with the national average or even below the national average in terms of the cost of higher education revenues that was borne on the backs of students and their families. But in that pre-2000s recession that shot up and never really recovered, and in the last recession shot up again. But based on their last funding increase, we're seeing a downward trend between 2013 and 2014. So I encourage you to do this for your own states as well. I think it kind of gives you a nice way to sort of see the story. We're located in Colorado, where they are much unlike WICHE states in terms of their funding levels per student are much higher. And the WICHE overall average may be driven more by a state like California, which is much more populous in enrollment, which trends below the national WICHE average. So you can play around with those two and kind of see what the story is for your individual state. Encourage you to do that. And then lastly, here we are at the state wave chart. So in addition, on that SHEF data provider page where you can download the data in an Excel format, if you want to just interact with it and see it here, you can do that as well. It defaults to the U.S. average, but you can select your state here and it will pull your state's individual wave chart so that you can see the difference between educational appropriations and net tuition over time. Minnesota, much like the national average, starts here where a big portion of the pie was educational appropriations, but then it's decreased over time to its current level, where now net tuition revenue is much higher. And then as Andy mentioned, because of some of the criticisms of HECA and how some people don't prefer it and say it's growing faster than CPI or CPI is a more accurate measure for the students, and the first thing they do with their data is unadjusted and adjusted for CPI anyways, well, you can do that in this tool. So if you click the drop-down menu and click CPI here, all these figures will change to adjust by CPI. The overall story doesn't change very much, I think, when going from HECA to CPI, but the overall trend looks the same, but some of the figures will be adjusted. And then if you want to look at the unadjusted for inflation data as well, then you can click the unadjusted tab, and you can see that the actual 1989 figure per student was $4,231, but when we adjust that for inflation, it looks more comparable to today's dollars. Then the last chart here is the United States wave chart just by itself, if you want to get back to the national average. Real quickly, we were encouraged to see a couple of news outlets actually embed these visualizations into their reports. This is Colorado Public Radio's website and their news beat, and they showed that Colorado versus the United States average story here on their news website. So we're encouraged to see that. We're happy to see that people are kind of taking the SHEF data and tailoring the data to tell a story for their state. Colorado has often trended above the national average in student share, but it's gotten more pronounced over the last two recessions. We also saw that Utah higher education system put out a news report where they embedded their state's wave chart, and they preferred the CPI adjustment as well. So when you default to that page, they adjust their data by CPI, but on that page, since it's embedded, you can still interact with the software and change it to HECA, CPI, or unadjusted, or view a different state as well. And one of our dear friends and colleagues, Robert Kelkin, when the report first came out, said, glad to see the new report, but I wish they'd use CPI to adjust for inflation instead of HECA, and we got to respond to him and say, you can actually do that yourself at the tablet site, and he thanked us for that. So we were happy to see that overall feedback. So it's your data, and we want to make it easy for you to interact with it and share this data with your stakeholders. And we invite your questions and comments for improvement as we go forward with this. We don't kind of view this as a one-time demonstration or a one-time product put out. We don't want to just update the data every year. We want to actually change what you can do in the Tableau software kind of over the course of the year. And so I would encourage you to get in touch with Andy or I if you have ideas as to how you would like the data to be presented or what would be helpful to you as you go through this data. I'll turn it back over to Andy. And we invite your questions at this time.
Thank you, John. We definitely have 10 minutes or so for questions. If anyone's interested, you can type them into the Q&A text box. So if there are questions, feel free to jump in and we can try to answer them. If there aren't any questions at this time.
I see a couple, Andy.
Okay.
So the first question I see is there any way to print the chart? And if you're talking about charts that are actually in the SHEF report, on that View the Data page, then you can click the link that allows you to go to the charts themselves. As for Tableau interactive charts, my workaround for printing that would be to use snipping tool on a Windows device, and you could make an image of anything that you currently see on the Tableau screen and turn it into a format that would be easier to print. I don't think there's a print capability in Tableau directly to do a screen cap of the image and then do that yourself, but you could work around it that way. I often use snipping tool as that sort of a workaround.
But as John mentioned, every table and chart from the actual report is available on the View the Data section of the website. So those are all now JPEGs that you can print off individually.
Another question, is the state appropriation only direct funding to institutions, or does it include state financial aid programs?
Good question. Our educational appropriations that we present does include state funding for financial aid for students attending public institutions, and that's actually why we then back it out on the net tuition side. So we back out those dollars to derive our net tuition numbers. Otherwise, you're kind of double counting it. But it is included in the educational appropriations, as is any local funding for community colleges for the 30 states that have a local property tax that funds their two-year sector. Another question? All right. Well, those are our questions. Feel free to email myself or John additional questions. And as John mentioned at the end of his Tableau demonstration, we want to make that usable for you guys. We're excited that we've already seen it used. But if you have any ideas on that, or if you kind of are familiar with the other components of SHEF that we didn't really talk about today, and you have ideas for incorporating that into the Tableau interactive data set, please email us, give us a call, because we want to make that as usable as possible. We do have some ideas that we're going to roll out in about 6 weeks that we're excited about, but the goal here is to provide stuff that you guys can use, so please let us know.
All right, I don't see anything else. Thank you to all the data providers, again, for making sure that your data is consistent, usable, accurate. We couldn't do it without you, and this is a really consistent, robust data set that we have reaching far back, and I think it's a powerful tool, and it's all because of folks like all of you on the phone who are able to get the data in and consistent, and it's been a privilege to work on this project, so thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.